My name is Patricia Fara, and I'm an Emeritus Fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. Welcome to my exp. Joseph Banks is extremely famous in Australia, but he's not very well known in Great Britain. He didn't make any great scientific discoveries. On the other hand, I think he's extremely influential and a very important figure in the history of science. He was president of the Royal Society for 42 years, which is a long time. And although he didn't write any great scientific papers, and he was very poor at mathematics, he was often criticised for his lack of mathematical ability, what he did do was bring together the government and scientific research. There's a famous saying by Francis Bacon that knowledge is power. And what Joseph Banks did while he was president of the Royal Society was convince the government that it was in their interests to invest in scientific research. The transit of Venus is an astronomical phenomenon that happens twice, roughly, in every century at a space of about 13 years. So in the middle of the 18th century, there was a transit of Venus when the planet Venus had travelled in between the Sun and the Earth. So for about 10 minutes, you could see a little black dot crawling across the surface of the Sun. And there was an international programme to measure the transit of Venus from different places on the Earth, because by doing that, you could work out important dimensions of the solar system, for instance, how far away the Sun was from the Earth. So for the second transit of Venus that happened in the 18th century, the King and the Admiralty provided money for James Cook to go to Tahiti to measure the transit of Venus. And Joseph Banks, who was a very, very wealthy young man, not yet the president of the Royal Society, but he was a fellow of the Royal Society, he announced that he was going to travel with James Cook, and he financed himself. They landed in Tahiti and they stayed there for about 6 weeks. And they did carry out their astronomical observations. Several European ships had been there before. So by this stage, the Tahitians knew what to expect, and they were rather wary of the new English people that arrived. French ships, which had arrived previously, had already introduced sexually transmitted diseases, so the Tahitians were absolutely right to be rather wary of this next shipload of British people who arrived. It's very difficult to get the reactions of the local people. We know a lot about what Cook and Banks and their shipmates felt when they arrived in Tahiti. What we don't know so much about is how the local Tahitians felt. There's a few scattered observations. So for instance, they were surprised that Europeans rowed their boats backwards and that they had such blonde hair. They were also very surprised that they attached such great significance to these metal objects with glass in, and they kept looking at the heavens and using triangular-shaped brass instruments to play around with and write down numbers. That seemed very, very vague. That seemed very strange to the Tahitians. I think they were probably also pretty surprised by the clothes that the English people wore, because they usually were dressed in their full naval uniform. So in terms of building the empire, Joseph Banks was absolutely crucial. So one thing he did was he served on the African Committee when that was first set up. And he knew that there was gold in Africa. So he suggested that it would be a very good idea if Britain seized most of the west coast of Africa. And he had this wonderful paternalistic model. He claimed that it would be to everybody's benefit, to the Africans' benefit, as well as to Britain's benefit, if the Africans dug up all the gold in the mines and shipped it back to Britain, and then Britain would become wealthy. So at one remove, Africans would benefit. Africans, he said, would also benefit by being ruled by Britain and also by being introduced to Christianity. In his words, Britain was going to civilize Africa, and he claimed that that was a mutually beneficial relationship. Another country where he had enormous influence was Australia. He was one of the very few people who'd been to Australia. So when the government was wondering what to do with all its prisoners, a lot of people were being imprisoned, quite often for quite small offences like stealing food for themselves and their family. The prisons were overflowing, and so the government had this wonderful idea of shipping the prisoners overseas. And Joseph Banks suggested that they go out to Botany Bay in Australia. So the first fleet of prisoners set off for Australia, and that was Joseph Banks' suggestion.